The woman waited until the waiter carried away the empty glasses before stepping closer to the table. Her clothes hung from her shoulders in torn, rain-stained layers, and one trembling hand pressed against her stomach as though she could silence the hunger twisting inside it. Across from her sat a tired-looking man beside a little pink backpack, staring at the last half of a chicken sandwich on his plate. The woman lowered her eyes and whispered, "Can I have your leftovers?" But instead of handing her the food, the single father covered the plate with his hand and said something that made every customer nearby fall silent. Within minutes, the woman was crying so hard she could barely stand, and before that afternoon was over, a secret hidden for 9 years would turn both of their lives upside down. Before we continue, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Oxley Stories if you believe kindness can rebuild a broken life and that everyone deserves a second chance. And tell us where you are watching from today, because somewhere in the world, someone may need to hear this story as much as you do. 36-year-old Callum Voss had not entered the busy sidewalk cafe looking for anyone to rescue. He had come because his 8-year-old daughter, Pippa, was attending a classmate's birthday party 2 doors away, and he had promised himself that for once he would not sit in his aging car counting unpaid bills. Callum worked 6 days a week repairing heating systems, yet every month ended the same way, with an empty bank account and another envelope he was afraid to open. His wife had died 4 years earlier after a sudden illness, leaving him with a grieving child, a mortgage he could barely manage, and the constant fear that one emergency would take away the small life he had fought so hard to preserve. That afternoon, the cafe meal was an extravagance bought with a gift card Pippa had won at school. Callum had eaten slowly, watching through the window for his daughter, never imagining that the desperate stranger approaching his table was connected to the darkest night of his past. The woman looked no older than 30, but hardship had carved years into her face. Her brown hair was tangled into a loose knot, one cheek carried a fading bruise, and her shoes were held together with strips of gray tape. Several customers looked away when she passed, while others tightened their grip on their bags. Callum noticed all of it, the fear in her eyes, the way she kept glancing toward the street, and the shame that seemed to hurt her more than hunger. When she asked for the leftovers, he instinctively covered the plate. Her shoulders fell, and she murmured an apology, already turning to leave. That was when he told her she could not have his leftovers because nobody should have to beg for scraps while he sat comfortably eating. He pulled out the empty chair and asked the waiter to bring her a fresh meal, the biggest one on the menu. The woman stared at him as if kindness were a language she had forgotten, but it was what Callum said next that broke her. He told her she could sit with him without explaining anything and without owing him anything. He said she did not have to perform her pain to deserve food. For several seconds, the woman remained standing, her eyes fixed on the clean plate being placed before her. Then her knees buckled, and Callum caught her before she hit the pavement. She clutched the edge of his sleeve and wept with the raw, frightened sound of someone who had survived too long without permission to collapse. Around them, conversation stopped. The waiter brought water, and Callum quietly shifted the pink backpack from the chair so she could sit. When the woman saw it, however, her entire expression changed. Printed on the front was a small silver fox beneath Pippa's name, and the woman whispered the child's surname with such certainty that Callum felt a cold uneasiness move through him. How could a stranger know the name of a daughter she had never met? The woman introduced herself as Alara Wynne, though she spoke the name hesitantly, almost as if she had not used it in years. She ate only 3 bites before carefully wrapping the rest in napkins. Callum told her she could finish everything, but she admitted she had learned never to consume an entire meal at once because she never knew when the next one would come. Then she asked whether his daughter's mother had been named Mara Voss. The sound of his late wife's name struck Callum like a hand against his chest. He demanded to know how Alara knew her, and the woman's eyes filled again. She reached beneath the torn collar of her sweater and pulled out a thin chain. Hanging from it was a small brass key and a scorched metal charm shaped like a crescent moon, the exact charm Mara had once worn on a bracelet, the one Callum believed had been destroyed in the apartment fire 9 years earlier. Callum pushed back from the table so abruptly that his chair scraped across the pavement. 9 years before, long before Pippa was born, Mara had been trapped in a burning apartment building where she worked as a volunteer counselor. Callum had arrived after the firefighters pulled her from an upstairs window. She survived, but another young woman on the same floor disappeared before investigators could question her. Mara refused to speak about what had happened inside. She suffered nightmares for months, and whenever Callum asked about the missing woman, she would close down completely. He remembered the crescent bracelet on Mara's wrist before the fire and remembered her telling him afterward that it was gone. Now half of that bracelet hung around Alara's neck, blackened at the edges. Callum felt suspicion harden inside him. Had this woman stolen from Mara, or had his wife hidden something far more serious? Alara's hands began shaking. She said Mara had given her the charm while smoke filled the hallway and the apartment walls burned around them. Alara had been 21 then, frightened, pregnant, and trying to escape a man who controlled every part of her life. Mara had spent months helping her gather documents and prepare to disappear safely, but the men discovered the plan. On the night of the fire, he broke into Alara's apartment, destroyed her belongings, and knocked over a lamp during the struggle. Flames spread faster than either woman understood. Mara could have run, yet she stayed, dragging Alara through the smoke until part of the ceiling collapsed between them. Before firefighters reached Mara, she pushed the crescent charm through a gap and told Alara to keep going. Alara escaped through a rear stairwell, but fear drove her away before the authorities arrived. She believed Mara had died, until she saw the name on Pippa's backpack. Callum wanted to reject every word. He had spent years believing he understood Mara's life, her courage, and even her silences. Yet Alara described details no stranger could have known, the pale scar across Mara's thumb, the song she hummed when nervous, and the habit she had of writing important phone numbers inside the covers of books. Alara said Mara had once promised that if anything happened, she would protect Alara's unborn child. But Alara miscarried several weeks after the fire while hiding in a bus station hundreds of miles away. Alone, injured, and terrified that her former partner would find her, she drifted from shelter to shelter, using false names and never contacting Mara. Years passed. Shame grew heavier. By the time she learned Mara had survived and later married Callum, Alara felt she had no right to return. Then, just as she finally gathered the courage to reach out, she found Mara's obituary online. The revelation hollowed Callum. For 4 years, he had kept Mara's phone disconnected but charged in a drawer because Pippa sometimes listened to old voice messages. He remembered one unsent draft he had found after Mara died, addressed only to the initials EW. It read, "You didn't ruin my life. You gave me a reason to be brave. Come home when you're ready." Callum had assumed it was a message to a former client, but now the initials made sense. Mara had waited for Alara. She had searched quietly and never told Callum the entire story, perhaps because Alara's safety depended on secrecy. The anger Callum felt was quickly replaced by grief for all the words his wife had carried alone. Yet one question remained: why had Alara appeared in his town on that exact afternoon after vanishing for nearly a decade? Alara lowered her voice and revealed that it was not an accident. 3 months earlier, she had been staying at a women's shelter when a volunteer helped her search public records. She discovered Mara had died and that Callum was raising Pippa alone. She saved enough money for a bus ticket and traveled to the city, intending only to visit Mara's grave and leave the crescent charm there. But her bag was stolen at the station, taking her identification, medication, and the few dollars she had left. For 9 days, Alara slept behind a closed bookstore and survived on water from public fountains. She visited the cemetery twice but could not bring herself to place the charm on the grave. It was the last physical proof that someone had once believed she was worth saving. That morning, she had decided to leave town on foot. Then she saw Pippa's name on the backpack and recognized the surname engraved beneath it. But before Callum could respond, a dark sedan stopped across the street, and Alara's face drained of color. A broad-shouldered man stepped from the car and began scanning the cafe. Ilara crouched behind the table, whispering that he worked for Dorian Hale, the man she had escaped years earlier. Dorian had never been charged for the fire because Ilara disappeared, and Mara's testimony had not been enough to prove how it started. In the years that followed, he built a respectable-looking property business while privately threatening anyone who connected him to the past. Ilara had recently contacted a legal aid organization about reopening the case. Somehow, Dorian learned she was alive. The man crossing the street was not looking for a homeless stranger, he was looking for the only witness who could destroy his employer. Callum's first instinct was to take Ilara and run, but then he saw Pippa coming out of the party venue with her friend's mother, skipping toward the cafe with a balloon tied around her wrist. Callum moved before fear could freeze him. He told the waiter to lead Ilara through the kitchen while he hurried toward Pippa. The man from the sedan changed direction, his eyes following Ilara's movement behind the windows. Callum reached his daughter, lifted her into his arms, and asked the other parent to take her back inside. Pippa sensed the panic in his voice and clung to him, asking what was wrong. He promised he would explain later and handed her over just as the stranger confronted him. The men claimed Ilara had stolen valuable documents and needed to be returned to her family. Callum said he had never seen her. The stranger smiled without warmth and warned that protecting someone like Ilara could bring trouble to his child. Hearing Pippa mentioned transformed Callum's fear into something steadier. He stepped closer and said the police were already coming, although he had not yet called them. The bluff worked long enough for the stranger to retreat to the sedan, but as it drove away, Callum noticed the license plate had been deliberately covered. Ilara was hiding inside the cafe's storage room when Callum found her. She apologized repeatedly, convinced she had placed Pippa in danger. Callum understood that helping her could threaten everything he had left, yet abandoning her would mean betraying the compassion that had defined Mara. He called the police and a local attorney recommended by the cafe owner. When officers arrived, Ilara nearly fled through the back door, but Pippa had been brought inside and was waiting near the kitchen. The child took one look at Ilara's torn clothes and frightened face, then removed the birthday cake wrapped in foil from her party bag and held it out. Ilara sank to the floor, accepting the small slice with both hands. Callum saw Mara in that gesture so clearly that his doubts finally broke. He could not control the danger coming toward them, but he could decide what kind of man his daughter would remember him becoming. At the station, Ilara gave a statement, but the case was more complicated than Callum expected. Most physical evidence from the fire had been destroyed, and Dorian's attorneys had spent years building doubt around Mara's original testimony. Ilara's account mattered, but without supporting proof, prosecutors could not guarantee protection or charges. Then Ilara placed the brass key from her necklace on the table. She explained that it opened a small railway locker Mara had rented the week before the fire. Mara had instructed her to use it only if their escape plan failed. Ilara never returned because she believed Dorian watched every station. The locker facility had since changed ownership, and no one knew whether its contents still existed. If the locker held what Mara had promised, it might contain records, photographs, and audio evidence of Dorian's abuse. But recovering it meant traveling back to the neighborhood where Ilara's nightmare began. Callum arranged for Pippa to stay overnight with his sister and drove Ilara to the old station under police supervision. During the journey, Ilara stared out the window, growing quieter with every mile. She admitted that she had rehearsed this return 1,000 times but always imagined Mara beside her. Callum confessed that he sometimes resented Mara for keeping secrets, then hated himself because the dead could not explain their choices. Ilara told him Mara had spoken about him constantly, even before they married. She had described Callum as the first person who made safety feel ordinary rather than temporary. She had also worried that telling him about Dorian would place him in danger, especially after she became pregnant with Pippa. Her silence had not come from mistrust. It had come from terror that the fire would follow her family home. The truth did not erase Callum's pain, but it finally gave it a shape he could understand. The old station smelled of rust and wet concrete. Rows of dented lockers lined a basement corridor that had been closed to the public for years. The facility manager confirmed that several abandoned units remained sealed because of an unresolved ownership dispute. Locker 317 was among them. When Ilara inserted the brass key, it would not turn. Corrosion had fused the lock, and for one terrible moment she believed they had come too late. A maintenance worker cut through the latch while an officer recorded the process. Inside sat a smoke-stained metal box, a blue scarf, and a paperback novel swollen with age. Ilara recognized the scarf as the one Mara had wrapped around her shoulders the first day they met. Callum opened the novel and found phone numbers written along the inside cover exactly as Ilara had described. Beneath it was an envelope bearing Callum's name. His hands shook as he unfolded the letter. Mara had written it 9 years earlier, expecting the possibility that she might not survive. She explained that Dorian controlled Ilara through threats, financial abuse, and violence. She had gathered copies of medical reports, photographs, bank transfers, and recordings of his threats. She apologized for involving Callum without telling him, but she wrote that meeting him had taught her love was not simply protecting the people closest to you. Sometimes it meant risking comfort so another person could escape a life that was slowly killing them. At the end, Mara asked him not to hate Ilara if she disappeared. Fear, she wrote, could make a prison out of the whole world. The last sentence was meant for a future neither of them knew would come. Should she ever find you, please give her a seat at our table before you ask where she has been. Callum sat down on the cold floor because his legs could no longer hold him. The memory of covering his plate at the cafe returned with painful clarity. He had thought his answer to Ilara's request was spontaneous, an act of ordinary decency. But somehow, 9 years earlier, Mara had asked him to make that exact choice. Ilara knelt beside him and wept over the letter, whispering that she had failed Mara by staying hidden. Callum told her she had survived, and survival was not failure. Yet before either could absorb the moment, an officer opened the evidence folder and discovered something unexpected. Among the recordings was a recent conversation dated only 2 months earlier. Dorian's voice could be heard discussing payments to locate Ilara and silence anyone helping her. The file proved not only the events surrounding the old fire but an active conspiracy happening in the present. Police moved quickly. Dorian was arrested the following morning while attempting to leave the state. The man from the cafe was identified through traffic cameras and agreed to cooperate after investigators confronted him with the recording. News outlets described the case as the collapse of a respected property developer, but Callum understood the real story was much quieter. It was about a frightened woman who carried a key for 9 years, a dead wife who had prepared for a future she would never witness, and a child who offered birthday cake without asking whether the hungry stranger deserved it. Still, an arrest did not magically repair Ilara's life. She had no identification, no home, no job history for recent years, and no confidence that kindness would last after the headlines disappeared. Callum helped her enter a trauma recovery program, but he refused to become her savior. He told Ilara that he would stand beside her while she rebuilt, yet the decisions had to remain hers. At first, progress came in painfully small pieces. She obtained replacement documents, slept through an entire night without waking in panic, and ate a full meal without saving half for later. Then a photograph of her at the cafe spread online, and cruel strangers accused her of manipulating a grieving father. Ilara packed her borrowed clothes and vanished from the recovery center before dawn, leaving only the crescent charm and a note claiming everyone would be safer without her. When Callum discovered she was gone, he understood how easily shame could undo months of courage. The police found no sign of her, and a storm was moving toward the city. Pippa was the one who guessed where Ilara might have gone. She remembered Ilara asking about Mara's grave and saying she still had something to finish there. Callum drove through heavy rain to the cemetery and found Ilara curled beside Mara's headstone, soaked and shivering. The crescent charm lay on the grass between them. Ilara said the hateful messages were right, that trouble followed her and that Mara might still be alive if they had never met. Callum wanted to deny it, but simple denial would not heal guilt that old. Instead, He read aloud the final paragraph of Mara's letter again, the part saying fear could make a prison out of the whole world. Then he told Alara that leaving would not protect Pippa, it would teach the child that wounded people must disappear whenever others become cruel. Staying, healing, and refusing to be ashamed would teach her something braver. Alara looked at the grave and asked what place she could possibly have in their lives. Callum answered that Mara had already chosen her place. She had asked him to give Alara a seat at their table. He did not promise everything would be easy, and he did not call her family before trust had time to grow. He simply told her there would be dinner at 6 the following evening, and the chair beside Pippa would remain empty until Alara decided whether to use it. Then he left the decision in her hands. The next day, 6 o'clock came and went. Pippa tried not to look disappointed as Callum served soup. At 6:12, there was still no knock. At 6:17, Callum began clearing the unused bowl. Then the doorbell rang. Alara stood on the porch wearing clean second-hand clothes and carrying a small paper bag. Inside was a loaf of bread she had bought with the first money earned from helping in the recovery center's kitchen. She apologized for being late because she had spent 10 minutes outside trying to believe the invitation was real. Pippa pulled out the chair beside her, and Alara sat down. For the first few minutes, she ate cautiously, still leaving part of the bread untouched. Then Pippa spread butter across the final slice and placed it on Alara's plate. No one mentioned leftovers. No one asked her to prove she belonged. They simply continued eating while the evening light filled the room Mara had once called home. In the months that followed, Alara testified against Dorian and helped secure convictions for several crimes. The compensation she received was modest compared with what had been taken from her, but it allowed her to rent a tiny apartment close to the recovery center. She began training as a peer counselor, determined to become for other frightened women what Mara had once been for her. Callum's life also began to change. The story of the railway locker inspired local residents to support a legal fund for survivors, and his heating repair customers quietly organized enough work to help him catch up on the mortgage. Yet the greatest change was not financial. Pippa stopped asking why her mother had been taken away so young and began asking how she could live with the same courage. Callum finally understood that Mara's story had not ended with her death. It continued in every person who chose not to look away. A year after the day at the cafe, Callum, Pippa, and Alara returned to the same table. Alara wore a simple blue dress and carried a folder containing her first official counseling certificate. The waiter recognized her and quietly placed 3 fresh meals before them. Alara smiled through tears and admitted she had spent years believing hunger was the worst thing a person could suffer. Now she understood that being treated as invisible was far more painful. Callum looked at the woman who had once asked for scraps and saw no trace of the defeated stranger others had avoided. He saw someone who had walked back into the fire of her memories and reclaimed her name. When they finished, Alara noticed a hungry elderly man lingering near the cafe railing, staring at an abandoned plate on another table. She stood, approached him gently, and asked whether he would join them for a fresh meal. The man hesitated, ashamed, but Alara pulled out the empty chair. Callum watched from across the table as she repeated the words he had once given her. He did not need to explain anything, and he did not owe them anything. Pippa reached into her backpack and placed a wrapped cookie beside his plate. In that moment, Callum understood why Mara had saved the crescent charm, the key, and the letter. She had not merely preserved evidence. She had planted a promise that kindness would continue moving from one wounded person to another long after she was gone. If this story touched your heart, please support the video by liking it, sharing it with someone who still believes compassion matters, and subscribing to Oxley Stories. Your engagement can help this message reach a person who may be surviving quietly and wondering whether anyone would offer them a seat at the table. Special request, comment, there is always a seat at my table, if you believe no struggling person should ever be made to feel invisible. Years later, Alara still kept the crescent charm, but she no longer wore the brass key beside it. The key was framed inside the recovery center where she worked, beneath a small handwritten note explaining that some doors remain locked for years because fear convinces us we have lost the right to open them. Every afternoon, when frightened newcomers entered the building, Ilara greeted them with a warm meal and an empty chair. She never asked what they had done to deserve help. She only asked whether they were hungry. And whenever someone looked down at the food and whispered that leftovers would be enough, Ilara smiled through the memory of the day her life changed and gave them the answer that had once left her in tears. No. You deserve something made fresh.